Hello, everybody. My name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy and Future. And today my guest is Jan van Tol, a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, retired U.S. Navy, a great friend of mine. Hello, Jan. How are you?
Hello, Jacek. Good to see you.
You know, for those of you who might not know, Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessment has been at the forefront of the debate about the modern warfare, precision warfare regime, OODA loop, all those things that were, titled Revolution Military Affairs, starting from the 1990s of the 20th century, as triggered by Andy Marshall at Office of Net Assessment. And CSBA was known for close relationships with those very top decision-making circles at Pentagon. So for those of our listeners and viewers who don't know that, and here we have our guest Jan van Tol. Jan, let's talk about the lessons learned in Ukraine. What this war is telling us about the evolution of the battlefield. What would you say? In the opening statements.
Okay. There are a couple of different areas to cover. One is the surprising, military incompetence of the Russian military. Simply because we had expected for so long that they were, if not 10 feet tall, well, certainly 6 or 7 feet tall. But there's been some very conspicuous things that didn't happen on the battlefield that we fully expected. For example, to conduct arms operations, one assumes that from their debacle in 2008 in Georgia and their intensive modernization efforts since that time, that they would be far more proficient in conducting such operations. The surprising lack of presence or ineffectiveness of the Russian Air Force startled many, many people. And of course, there were serious command and control deficiencies. And one of the real weaknesses shown was the very poor logistics and sustainment operations to support the combat units forward. We all remember the 40-kilometer long convoy north of Kiev near the start of the war. The other side, was the surprising effectiveness of the Ukrainian forces. And the base really seems to have been the use of short-range precision-guided weapons. Now, when I say short range, I'm not talking bazooka range or hand grenade throw range. Short range can be in the several kilometers, or many thousands of feet altitude for surface-to-air weapons, whether vehicle-mounted or man-fed. For use in certainly was the primary element early on in stopping the Russian advances. Now, I should also mention there's a contingency event here. The Russians certainly expected to take Kyiv within a handful of days, and a lot depended on them being able to take the airfield that was close to Kyiv, about a handful of kilometers northwest. And the Ukrainians were able to defeat that effort, and that seems to have been the beginning of a catastrophic failure on the part of the Russian army to make it to Kyiv early on.
Yeah, but what were the reasons for that? Was it a poor chain of command in modern warfare, where the decisions ought to be made quickly and at least swifter than the enemy? Was it because the poor coordination between the units? Was it the completely mismatched combination of the battalion tactical groups that were short of manpower and the punch? What was wrong? Was it logistics that was separated from the front units? What were the battlefield elements that failed?
Well, it's foremost, and this is based on some conversations with Eastern European military officers as well, in conjunction with the work we've done in the recent past, that at the start, at the very top of the issues, it seems to us, is the very poor command and control. One of the things that seems to be missing in Russian doctrine and Russian organization are intermediate layers of command between the military districts or army level and then down to battalion tactical groups. That leads to a great deal of rigidity. And then there's the notion that the Russians tend to carry out orders to the point where they're stopped, and then rather than taking the initiative the way European militaries would tend to take, they would stop and wait for the new plans or the new orders. But there's nothing in that intermediate level of between very high and at the battalion tactical group level. That seems to be a very serious failure. The next one, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, interesting. That was my comment. Very interesting observation.
And then the logistics part. I mean, this is the old phrase everybody knows. Operations are for beginners, but logistics are for the real masters of warfare. You have to have logistics support of sustained combat operations, and that was manifestly missing. You saw line units passing up through constricted terrain with no provision for the logistics to keep up with them. There was no protection either. That's just a couple of the flaws that we saw.
Yeah, and apparently the Russians later on in phase 2 of the war in the Donbass were much more competent when there was a railway gauge at the railways, front end. I mean, the railway system operating close by, but if it was so to be on the on the wheeled tracks, the logistics was really failing. So, did you notice this, that it's all about railway system in the Russian land warfare doctrine and operations?
Yes. In fact, in doing our research for a monograph we put out in June about the deterrence of the Baltic region, some of the folks we looked into were people like Michael Kaufman at the Center for Naval Analysis and some others who made the observation that the Russians have a very good internal railway system, and in fact, it's key to their ability to move units. But as soon as they cross borders, they don't have that access to the adequate railway system. That's been destroyed by a defending country, or whether it's a different gauge, or whether they're, for whatever reasons, they can't extend that resilient railway network into occupied territory.
Mm-hmm. What surprised you in the performance of the Ukrainian side?
Well, the fact that again they were able to use those short-range precision-guided weapons, many of which not trained on before, javelins and that sort of thing, that they received at the last moment from the Baltic nations, certainly the United States and others, and British equivalent weapons. They were able to employ these quite competently early on. Now, that says something in many cases about the ease of use of many, but not all, of these kinds of weapons. There was also the ability to use targeting by UAVs, and apparently they were also able to exploit, potentially with Allied help, such things as Russian use of cell phones to detect where certain units or even individuals were. The proliferation of these weapons at fairly low levels in the Ukrainian operations, I don't know, platoon company level, contributed as well to the large number of kills. That in tactics, such as knocking out the last vehicles in a particular column so the others couldn't escape, and then destroying the ones ahead at leisure, or in many cases, the Russian crews simply abandoned the vehicles.
Mm. Yeah, we saw a lot of abandoned vehicles. What is the psychology? How is the psychology working? Because it's not only the effect of the javelin hit or something, but it's also some sort of psychological effect. If the logistics is failing, command and control is not working properly, and there is even a gossip between soldiers, right? That something is wrong and I won't survive. Could you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, you call it psychological factors. I would call it morale in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the morale on the Russian side obviously was very, very poor, and that could be based on lack of faith in their chain of command, particularly once they started taking real losses. Um, the high attrition rates, the apparent lack of support for their units, all these things contributed to lack of morale, as far as I can tell. Plus, there's the business that a lot of observers have noted. Apparently, at the soldier level, most of the soldiers had no idea why they were actually engaged in these operations, other than a vague exhortation that we have to defeat Nazis or some nonsense like that. And on the Ukrainian side, well, if you're defending your country out of outrance, that certainly suggests a very high morale. You're defending your home and hearth, your own people, and historically, certainly for Western Ukrainians, there's a great deal of hatred of Russians. You may remember in the early part of the Barbarossa campaign in World War II, many Ukrainians actually welcomed the arrival of German troops into Ukraine. So there is that ethnic dislike.
That is true. You mentioned the apparent failure of the Russian Air Force to impose its will and dominate the battlefield. So, what was the reason? How did it, happen? So, what are your thoughts at CSBA?
Well, I mean, I can only speculate, of course, but there are a number of different possibilities. One is relatively low levels of training. There may be doctrinal failure. I'm not familiar with the Russian Army Air cooperation doctrine. I don't know how they do close air support, but one would think that a modern Air Force would be one of its primary missions, as would suppression of enemy air defenses, or SEAD. That obviously didn't happen either, because the Ukrainians kept shooting down fighters, but especially helicopters, and are still doing so today, although not in as many numbers as before.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so what would you say about UAVs? You know, the role of UAVs at CSBA. I learned from you guys about UAVs, their future, third offset strategy. You know, air sea battle concept, swarms of UAVs, loyal wingmen. All those concepts I learned from reports of CSBA. So you're the best person to ask. So what do you make of the use of UAVs? How do they change the way you operate on the front?
Well, I mean, some of the concepts you discussed that we are in fact working on at CSB are more futuristic, particularly the notion of swarm attack and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
What we've seen here, certainly creative employment of UAVs, but in some cases relatively simple. For example, using UAVs like the TB2s to provide targeting information to some of these short-range precision-guided weapons. But remember, some of these have several kilometers of range. And we've seen the so-called kamikaze UAVs, which in a sense are precision-guided, short-range precision-guided weapons of their own. I consider them weapons when employed in that usage.
That can loiter and can come back home, so they don't need to be wasted in one go. So it's even better than that ATGMs or something, yeah?
Yeah, no, it depends on the type of UAV. I mean, some of the cheaper ones can be considered expendables. Those are the ones that I would tend to employ as kamikaze ones. You want them to go to their target and kill it. Now, you can also have UAVs, like you say, that are capable of loitering, that are able to detect their own targets and then go in for the kill. Or with somewhat larger UAVs, they can carry their own smaller missiles, like, for example, Hellfire missiles in the case of the U.S. Navy.
Yeah. So how does it affect the battlefield in terms, for example, about the tank use? Now I can imagine that, if you have a tank, then it's a big issue to really get to the front confrontation engagement with another tank of your enemy from your enemy side. First, you need to make sure that you're not spotted by UAV like 50 clicks from the front. Yeah. Then you need to make sure that you're not hit by the precision artillery fire. So you don't concentrate, right? Because it's scary. Once you concentrate, you're a lot, you're noisy, you're visible, you can be spotted, and artillery will cover you. Then there is loitering munition. Then there is ATGMs. Then there is minefields, and then direct hit from another tank. So what does it tell us about the future of tanks? And concentration. Are we seeing the end of the Napoleonic principle of concentration of mass, and now it's dispersal and concentration of fires from the dispersal positions? How would you explain that in the terms of art of war and its evolution?
Yeah, I think it's premature to say that tanks will never matter again. What it involves, though, again, is combined arms. You need infantry and air defense in conjunction with tanks or armored or mechanized units to be able to function on the modern battlefield. And even then, we would expect high attrition. But it's early to say that tanks are not worth anything. Remember the way the Russians sent those tanks down the road to Kiev? They were sitting ducks. They didn't do defenses, whether infantry, whether point air defenses, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, but why are the Russians have much fewer UAVs? They seem to be a great industrial power with great tradition of military industrial complex, and now they are buying UAVs from Iran. Now they have run out of missiles, and they are thinking about purchasing missiles from Iran. They are getting artillery shells from North Korea. What happened? Yeah, what happened to them in terms of the reserves? They had, depots. They were known for that, in the past, and Soviet Union including.
Yeah, well, I'm speculating again a little bit with regard to the Russian military being derivative of the former Soviet Union. Their doctrine seems to be fairly rigid. In other words, you stick to the plan, you act on orders rather than, say, in the West, using mission Auftragtaktik or mission control.
Yeah, yeah.
Let me see what else on that. Sorry, explicate the question a little bit more. I lost my train of thought there.
Yeah, just a basic direct question: why the Russians are having fewer UAVs than Ukrainians?
On the UAVs, well, I think part of it was overconfidence. Remember that this was a done deal. They didn't expect real opposition, apparently. Also, go heavily by and apparently hadn't thought about the employment of UAVs to any great extent. Because in essence, they didn't need to. In other words, they would win by mass. And in a sense, they're holding on in Donbass and in the south simply by mass artillery. Nothing really very modern.
Yeah, yeah. But apparently so. What do you think? How would the choppers like Apache would fare at the battlefield like that? Would they make a difference?
Well, we have a historical example from the U.S. campaign in Iraq in 2003. You remember the rapid advance up the Tigris and Euphrates River. What people tend to forget is that the Apaches, I think from the 101st Airborne, suffered considerable attrition from man pads. Now, they weren't always knocked down, but a large proportion of Black Hawks came back at least damaged. So that was sort of a portent. I would suggest that helicopters are particularly vulnerable to short-range air defenses, whether it be man pads or better, because they're larger missiles, vehicle-mounted point defenses. In a sense, you can say that these short-range weapons, these short-range SAMs, could be considered a sort of aerial minefield. In other words, a place where helicopters go, they might never know where such a weapon might come from. In the same way, going back to the tanks thing, if you have a number of loitering UAVs and you're the tank commander and you're looking around where could a threat come from, now you really have a proliferation of potential areas where something that can kill you can be. So that conceptually, I think of these things as these UAVs as almost mobile minefields, metaphorically.
Nicely put. Yeah. And what do you think about all those Ukrainian fashion of using cell phone applications to sort of consolidate OODA loop and using Starlink, Elon Musk's Starlink system to really create loops? How do you judge all those developments on the battlefield?
Well, I mean, clearly the Starlink system contributed materially to maintaining communications, including, I suspect, receipt of intelligence information from NATO countries. Obviously, the United States, the United Kingdom, the more advanced military, shall we say.
Yeah.
And that's the
Yeah.
way to get the information down. Without Starlink and the connectivity there, it seems to me very unlikely that the Ukrainians would have been as lethal as they were in the early part of the war.
Yeah, the Russians were complaining that they really had a rigid system of control and command, and communication was failing. Why the Ukrainians had those, shiny Starlink terminals? Then, even at the platoon level, they were capable of completely seamless communication.
Well, we don't know if it was completely seamless, but certainly resilient communications
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that the Russians could not substantially negate those.
Yeah. Okay, let's move to the blue waters. What do you make of all this eternal fight between the ship and the coast, between the ship and the fort? What does the Ukraine war in Ukraine tell us about this eternal fight between the offense and defense, between the ships and this time rockets, missiles hitting them? What
Yeah,
what
that's a good.
is yeah
Yeah, in a sense, you remember Air Sea Battle was about China's major anti-axis area denial operational approach on a very large scale. In a
yeah
sense, you could say the Ukrainians did a mini A2AD approach in the northern Black Sea, or at least within 50, 100 kilometers of the coast. In terms of attacking ships, it doesn't really matter where the cruise missiles come from, whether it's air launched or ground launched or from a ship or submarine.
Yeah, so apparently the cruise missiles turned out to be very effective, even against robust big deck ships like cruiser Moskva, right? Were you surprised not only by the fact that it was hit, and the defense was overwhelmed, but also the size, the dimensions of destruction? It's not hitting the keel; it's above the waterline, and still the ship sank. I remember in the past talking to you about sinking the ships of the U.S. Navy in the Western Pacific by cruise missiles, I remember you were telling me that usually you need to break the keel to make it happen, and something like that. Could you elaborate on that as a retired U.S. Navy? So
Yes, certainly. No, I mean, attack by underwater weapons, torpedoes and mines, because of the nature of the bubble that it creates, lifts the keel up and breaks the ship in most cases, unless you're talking very large ships, say above 40, 45,000 tons or so.
yeah.
So those are really the killer weapons. Cruise missiles usually aren't fatal.
Mhm.
Um, it appears to me, from what I've read from various sources, is that the Moskva itself, in terms of the ship design, probably was in pretty poor material condition. I don't know its design in detail, but I suspect it was far less compartmentalized than U.S. Navy ships. U.S. Navy ships have many, many different compartments, all of them, all of which can be sealed by watertight closures, whether doors or hatches, whatever. Could be the case that the Moskva simply wasn't as robustly built from a damage control point of view. It also seems pretty clear that they were psychologically caught unprepared, that they never dreamed that a missile could come from land. I'll give an example from the U.S. Navy, one that I'm a little ashamed of, but back in 1987 in the Persian Gulf, you remember that one, it's the USS Stark, was struck by two Iraqi Exocet missiles, not because the
Yeah.
Iraqis had necessarily targeted the Stark, but she was close enough and the missiles saw them first.
Mm-hmm.
And in the investigation afterwards, basically what that crew and that captain said was, well, we were neutrals, which is obviously a crazy, incompetent thing to say. My suspicion is that they never expected attack, that they probably weren't what the U.S. Navy would call a general quarters situation where everybody's manned up, all the watertight enclosures are closed, firefighting stuff is ready to go. I think they were just psychological.
I see. Yeah, but still, even a few days ago, there was another attack against the Sevastopol naval port, with the, allegedly with the use of the, underwater drones. Anyway, UA systems, automated systems, and unmanned systems that were either sailing underwater or on the water and hitting several ships. How would you, elaborate on that to the non-professionals? How does it work? What's the benefit of using such systems compared to missiles? And what does it say us about the evolution of the battlefield, that this, systems penetrated probably the defensive systems, and it's not easy to get into the anchorage, right, in the naval warport?
Well, one of the advantages of UAVs and modern navigation systems is that these systems can be programmed to go to different places, to have different routes. In some cases, maybe change the routes according to what onboard sensors may see. Again, I don't know the specifics of the weapons used here, but in a sense, this was something old we've seen before. It was a raid, but the method used, the UAVs, both surface UAVs and aerial UAVs. I haven't heard anything about undersea ones. So just USVs and UAVs. That these guys can be programmed to go on complex paths, and then presumably they had explosives on board and crash into their targets. And I don't know how sophisticated these things were. In theory, you could think to yourself, they may have sensors that have automatic target recognition features that say, I see one of these things, I'm going to impact that.
Yeah.
But in terms of being a raid, when I say, in a sense, it's something old, but in terms of the concept, it's just the weapons are different. I'll give you the example of the British carrier raid on the Italian fleet in November 1940, using torpedo bombers that were still biplanes, hopelessly antiquated, but they were a very novel use of a new system. Another example from World War II is two British battleships sunk at the end of 1941 in Alexandria, Egypt, by Italian frogmen. That was a raid, but it was pretty devastating. One of the things that sticks out in this example is the tremendous cost differential, what these UAVs and whatever weapons they had would have cost, and the cost of the targets that they hit. That's tremendously disproportionate. That's something that navies are going to have to think about, and I know the U.S. Navy is thinking about quite actively.
Yeah. So if you were a Russian Black Fleet commander, how would you use the ships now after such devastating blows to your, ships, order of battle? And if you were ordered to impose a distant blockade on the grain supplies out and in Ukraine, what would you do given these, confrontation between missiles and ships?
The only thing I would do, if I were the Russian commander and ordered to do this thing, I'd say I'd have no choice but to salute and do the best I could. Just tactically speaking, I would think I would intercept grain shipments much further south in the Black Sea. Obviously, you can't come too close to Turkey. I would also use what assets I have these to sow more mines. I would use defensive mining, particularly close to the desert.
Yeah, it seems very instinctive, yeah, to impose this, even the much more distant blockade, far away from coasts where missiles could be employed, and of course offensive mining. Yeah, interesting. So what do you think we're gonna see in terms of the air battlefield? Do you think that the U.S. will deliver, or the NATO or the West will deliver manned platforms to Ukrainian Air Force? But
Yeah, we were talking about if I were the naval commander, if I were ordered to take action, then I'd do the offensive mining. But if I were the naval commander, I would recommend strongly to my superiors keep my ships in port because it's too lethal out there. Now, as we've seen, it's lethal in port too if you're not prepared to defend yourself. The example I give is the Falklands War in 1982, when the British submarine sank an Argentinian cruiser. The rest of the Navy was called home because it was just too unsafe for warships.
yeah, it is true that there is a principle, like Julian Corbett wrote, and also Mahan, that once the dominance is established, the game is over at the sea, right? At least, maybe excluding submarine warfare, yeah, in a symmetrical battlefield. Yeah, if you agree with me.
Yeah, I would agree with that. If the Russians maybe had operating submarines down there, I haven't seen any reporting of that. Then what I'd again be using them for is to lay mines near Odessa and certain other areas.
Yeah. Jan, let's imagine just we're moving towards the end of our conversation. Let's imagine that you are in charge of fielding the Polish new model army, the new model force of the future, based on the lessons learned in Ukraine, and it's quite close to Poland. It's exactly the same battlefield in terms of land warfare, the same enemy. So, how would you, what army would you field? First of all, what domain is the dominant? What were you be thinking first? What would, center of gravity would be, main focus, and so on, so on. Because we, as you know, Poland has, during the war, initiated the largest modernization military program ever in 1,000 years of our history. Yeah. So, if all plans that are there comes to fruition, we probably we're going to have the largest land force in Europe, maybe except Ukraine and Russia, depending on the outcome of war, and by far the largest land force, and maybe one of the most competent if the plans are realized. So, apart from the current plans, what would be your idea? What kind of force would you field to meet the future and be a dominant power?
Well, I mean, I think that Poland has made some significantly good investments. Certainly, the acquisition of F-35s would be very, very useful. How they're employed and how lethal the Russians would be in the future if they weren't, if they were far more proficient than they have turned out to be now, say in 10 years. Such assets may also be vulnerable. But for now, the F-35s is a good start. I think there's a premium that continues to be there with combined arms operations. But I would also include far greater distribution of these short-range PGWs down several echelons, down to company, even platoon level, in order to force the Russians to think about where could threats come from, and it's a much greater area than they might have thought about. And oh, by the way, they would have to dedicate far more resources to killing these distributed packets of precision-guided weapons. Now, a lot of these weapons, these short range, I remind everybody that we're talking about kilometers in some cases, 20, 30 kilometers as far. It's not a bazooka I'm talking about, but it's about making units at the lower level, and many more of them, far more lethal than they've been on the past because of precision. And one of the good things about a number of these short-range PGWs is, especially if combined with small UAVs for targeting, your connectivity problem is far less problematic than if you have these the high dependence on real connectivity across great distances, maybe via satellite or whatever. Adversaries know that connectivity is key, certainly to the way the United States is planning to fight, and NATO by extension as well. Having far more distributed lethality also at the same time makes the targeting problem much simpler and much harder to interdict. Now, let me turn to one other area, as everybody tends to think about the toys, the platforms, the weapons, whatever. There's a number of other things that are very important too to making a lethal military. You want a lot of your critical targets to be hardened. You want to have distributed logistics in the sense that you don't have all your key things in a relatively small number of places, which are very likely to be known by the Russians and destroyed earlier. Because of the nature of the Polish geography, especially with the Vistula and some other rivers, you need to be able to replace busted bridges because there's going to be logistics warfare too if the Russians have learned from their lessons.
Yeah.
So all those indirect things are almost, the enablers, so to speak, are almost as important as the actual weapons and platforms. Makes sense?
Yeah, but would you make the force heavy or lighter, tracked or wheeled? How would, whether every tank should have indigenous UAV on it to create another dimension of reconnaissance? What kind of solutions here?
Well, I mean, the heavier you go, the more expensive individual platforms are, and the fewer you have, thus the greater proportion of combat power is tied up in them when one gets destroyed. So the question seems to be the larger question is, how do you maintain the resilience and highest possible leap of your force as a war progresses, and presumably attrition occurs, hopefully more on their side than on yours. You will inevitably, the good guys will inevitably suffer attrition as well. So distribution seems to be terribly important. That's something that U.S. services are going for. I can speak more to Navy with distributed maritime operations, but the Army is also, and the Marines especially, are working hard on creating dispersed but lethal smaller units.
Yeah, so smaller units, more dispersed. Concentration is not important anymore. It might be a threat to yourself. And precision is creating this shift. Yes? Precision.
Yes. Precision is what's key to being able to mass effects from dispersed areas.
Yeah.
Now, that said, I think it's too early to dismiss the notion of mass. I don't necessarily mean artillery tubes and that sort of thing, but at a certain point, you still need to mass missiles, for example, in what we call the salvo competition. You have robust defenses. If you're going against Kaliningrad, for example, right? Assuming that they have more effective air and missile defense than has been shown so far, or at least that they're more competent than other elements of the Russian militaries that we've seen in Ukraine, you're still going to have a mass of weapons at a certain point to overcome such defenses. That's just an example where mass may still matter.
Yeah, since you mentioned the salvo competition, do you think that Poland should strive to get our own salvo competition capabilities in terms of the cruise missiles, long range, even ballistic missiles, long range, to really stand on the escalation ladder head to head with the Russian enemy and really keep fighting?
I would question about ballistic missiles done on a purely national basis. For NATO, I think it certainly comes into question. Of course, there are escalation implications. So if you have a ballistic missile, the time of flight to Moscow or other targets is so short. And on the receiving end, they don't know if it's conventional warhead or something else. But yeah, in terms of weapons, I recommend this to all the allies that we do exercises with, and also with our own Pentagon, and that is plus up the weapons accounts, because those are the accounts that tend to be most easily stolen from to meet other requirements, so to speak. Missile inventories are unfortunately a lower priority in many cases, and yet the history of missile warfare suggests the expenditure rate of those missiles is way higher than anybody ever expects, starting with the 1973 Arab Israeli War, for example.
Yeah, that is true. That is true. So what else would you do to the Polish new model force? What sort of mobilization system, for example? What do you think? What are the lessons learned from Ukraine in terms of the mobilization? Of course, it seems obvious that you need to have reserves, but how do you make reserves in the 21st century? Is it a mass mobilization system like the Russian one, which seems not to be working, or maybe all volunteer force? Once these people, citizens, see that you're fighting properly, you're competent, you're modern, then people flee to the arms, and then you create, what do you think?
Yeah. Well, the problem with an all-volunteer force is if you suffer high attrition rates, and then the people coming in, the reserves, if they're not well trained, are in a sense cannon fodder. And we're seeing that lived out in real time with the Russians. They're calling up all these reserves, but the people who would normally be expected to train them are either at the front or dead, as it is right now. So to have a reserve force, you have to have people who have served in the army, or in the military, which implies a large proportion of the citizenry will have done military service for a time, and then trained regularly as reserves. It's basically the model that the Swiss had during the Cold War, although the Swiss have done away with that now. There's also, I know that Poland's got some territorial defense forces, volunteers, as I understand it, that are regionally based. In other words, people serve in their home region or province or whatever. Those are the sorts of units that can, in theory, also be equipped with or have access to these short-range precision-guided weapons, because many of those are quite easy to use. But that entails, of course, regular training.
Yeah.
It's the same sort of advice that we've given to the Estonians, to the Taiwanese, and that sort of thing. Because if the threat is existential, then the question is, why isn't the population more engaged? I think they are in Poland. I'm not so sure about some of the other countries. I know they are in Estonia.
Yeah, that is true. That is true. That is true. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you, Jan, for sharing your wisdom and experience and understanding of the battlefield. I hope I'll make a chance to convince you again shortly. I hope you will agree to our interview. Thank you very much. Today, our guest at Strategy&Future was Jan van Tol, Senior Fellow at Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments in Washington, D.C. Thank you, Jan.
Thank you, Jacek. Bye.